We're going to take a look here at bones in Lightwave, of which there are two types. There is the Z-axis type bone, and there is the joint type bone. Both of these things share certain similarities, but they also have significant differences, so we will look at them each in turn. But to start off with, let's just make note of a couple of little details about them. Bones are, of course, just like any other item in layout. They behave exactly the same, they respond the same to motion control and everything else. What's helpful is to think of them as having something of a two-part structure. Firstly, their pivot point from which they rotate and so on, and then their actual length, which we can think of as the deformer. Generally we are using bones to deform meshes, and it does help to think of them as having these two parts to them: the point of pivot and the deformer portion. In a Z-axis bone, the two are inseparable, they're just part of a singular unit. And the deformer portion always points down the Z-axis. If you rotate the pivot and record it off, the deformer portion still points down the newly oriented Z-axis, hence Z-axis bones. With joints, these two parts are separate, so you have this joint part, then you have this central deformer part. Also with joints, this deformer part only exists by virtue of having a second joint afterwards. These here are two joints, whereas this is only a single Z-axis bone. With that basic covered, we'll get rid of the joints for now and focus our attention just on the Z-axis bones. So here we have a plane that our bone is a child of. Meshes are always affected by the bones that exist as their children, and bones always have to exist as a child of something. Although you can change this out. If I select the plane here, then go over to bones mode, in this case the bone selects because I have a bone, but let's say that I didn't, you can still bring up the properties and you'll see that you have the option use bones from object, in this case itself. If I had other objects in here, nulls or whatever, I could choose for this mesh to be deformed by the bones of that object. However you have the bones assigned to a given mesh, however, whether it's their own children or coming from another object somewhere, the bone must be skinned to the mesh itself. And at the moment you'll see that this bone is having no effect. If we look closely, we can see that the bone sort of has this dotted line around it, and if I bring up its properties, we'll notice bone active checkbox here is blank. This bone is in an inactive state. It's also currently in an unrested state. Resting, which you can do by pressing the R key on a bone, which you see there changes the shading of the bone, has the effect of binding the bone to the mesh, or the mesh to the bone rather, I should say. And you'll notice that now the mesh travels along with the bone itself. Why does the mesh travel with the bone? Well, because the bone is currently affecting all points of the mesh, all of its vertices. And it's doing this because there are no other bones, and also because if we look back at the properties, we can see that the bone weight map is set to none. When a bone has a weight assignment of none, it will affect all vertices of an object. So weight map none might be better thought of as weight map all. It won't simply affect vertices that do not have weight maps on them. It will affect all vertices irrespective of if those verts have weight maps or not. And we won't worry about weights too much here. We'll see all of that in another video. So let's clone this bone off. So we get another one in there, and you'll see that straight away my plane is starting to drag here. The reason is because this bone is rested, it is skinned to the mesh, it is active. We can deactivate that bone, move it around somewhere else, and you'll notice that if I reactivate the bone, the mesh still jumps. That's because the bone still has its same recorded rest position. If you want to move a bone in something and re-skin it back in place, you just re-record it, push R again. Now we see that we have two bones in our mesh, and both bones are affecting the entire mesh because neither has a weight map, and you can see that we get this effect here, where each bone grabs a portion of the mesh. Bones do this based on their fall-off settings. We saw way back in the foundations video when we were talking about the different mesh structures that you might want to use, that with different densities one uses different bone fall-off. This is the first thing about how bones work when they skin to mesh. is that they grab vertices. Whether they're grabbing no weight map or an actual weight map is irrespective. They still have a fall-off distance, so they will grab more strongly at vertices close to them and more weakly at vertices further away from them. And you can change that fall-off by changing this value here, which will give you different effects. For instance, here at inverse distance 2, you can see that what I'm getting is bulge up near this bone. That's because these outer vertices here are still getting influence from this bone here. These low numbers represent a wide fall-off range for the bone, whereas higher numbers like this represent a much tighter fall-off. In this case, these outer vertices over here on the left-hand side of the screen are getting their influence entirely from this bone, because there's no other bone as close to them as this one. Were we to clone it again, so as we had a third bone and we can stick that over there and re-rest it, then we would see that we get this sort of effect with the 128 distance and an effect more like this with the 2. You can see that these verts on the edge are still getting mixed influence like that. Bones also have a strength value here. If we take that down, we can see that that will change their strength. Effectively, what it changes in a manner is their fall off. You can see that as I increase strength, the fallout for that bone gets greater. The actual strength on these vertices that it's immediately over the top of doesn't change that much. This strength, therefore, is relative to the other bones in the mesh, or which are affecting the mesh. And it's most easy to think of it, most understandable to think of it as affecting the fall-off range. Think of it as kind of a multiplier for the fall-off range, if you will. The other setting that bones have is a rest length here, which you can change, making the bone bigger or smaller. This isn't simply a cosmetic effect of the icon. It will indeed have an effect over the influence of the bone, because of course we think of this big icon here as the deformer. We can see with that made larger, we're getting this sort of effect when I move the bone, and of course we can see as I change the rest length with the bone moved like that, that we are seeing again a shift in its influence. We see that in part this has to do with the multiply strength by rest length option. Clearly, if we think of the strength as kind of a multiplier on top of the fall off, then multiplying the strength by the rest length means that the rest length is also sort of having an effect into the fall off range of the bone. If we turn that off, we can see that there is a jump there. But notice that by affecting the rest length, although these outer vertices to the side here cease to have any effect from adjusting the rest length due to having unmultiplied the strength, we can see that the vertices on this forward edge here do indeed change how the bone influences them. The reason for that is that the rest length defines which vertices are grabbed by the bone. You see, if I pull it back like here, we can see that these verts aren't being affected much, and that's because the bone isn't reaching out that far. Let me bring it all the way down like this, still of course with strength by rest length off. You can see that these verts out at the front edge here are getting even less effect from the bone, because in its base position, in its rested position here, the actual deformer isn't reaching out to those vertices. But when it's rest lengthed out so that it does, it grabs them more strongly. What this means is that you have a few different ways that you can dice up the influence from one bone to the next in a hierarchy, in a full skeleton in something. Usually, of course, in a soft deforming organic style character or similar. In the case where you're rigging a machine or a mechanic component and things are just block weighted to single bones, if that's the method that you've chosen to employ, then of course none of this would make any difference because you would only have one bone per weighted area. The only part of this that cannot be altered on a bone by bone basis is the fall off type. That is for the bone collection as a whole. That is for the mesh as a whole. Whatever distance you set here as the fall off for the bone is all of the bones, not just the current one. So individual adjustments are made by tweaking the strength and the rest length. settings here. So all of that takes us nicely into having a look at scaling on the bones and how that works, and what we see is that it's much the same story as with the other modes of transformation. We get a proximity based effect and it's grouped around the deformer here, falling off at greater distances. In front as well as behind, of course, we always notice that the deformation from our bone isn't centred around the bone's pivot point, but around the actual bone itself. We also see this playing out with the rest length. If you change it and re-rest your bone, you can see how these changes in rest length affect which vertices are getting grabbed. Something you also notice, of course, is that I'm repeatedly re-resting this bone, and yet the mesh is remaining deformed irrespective of the scale that it has. This scale is not resting in, and that's an important thing to note with bones. What you cannot do is scale them and then rest them with that scale. Activate, deactivate them, do whatever you like, it won't work. This basically means that when you rest your bones, you must always do with the bones at scale 1. One mistake, of course, that people make is they'll try scaling out bones in some sort of fashion when trying to fit them into a rig to make the points fit. But all that does when you rest is distend your mesh, because of the scaling that is applied to them. What we also get with bones are these different compensation fixes that we can use that will change the way in which they deform a mesh. For instance, if we bend here like this and we turn on joint comp, we see that there's a shift up and down either side of the joint there, up and down as per the length of this bone here. If we turn it on for parent, we can see that there's a similar jump across the axis of the parent length like that. And with both on, this has set out some volume preservation here at the corner of our turn. Notice with Z bones that these options only work on the pitch axis. If you rotate on other axes such as the heading, none of them have any effect whatsoever. So not only are these effects always applied only when the pitch channel rotates, but they're also applied on the pitch axis, so things like muscle flexing there for the lower item or for the parent are happening in line with the pitch in this sort of fashion. Here, of course, you'll notice that I am going without a weight map, so each bone is just grabbing the vertices nearest to itself and manipulating those. As such, this weight-free, as it's casually known in Lightwave, method of skinning and using the compensation adjustments can be a great way to get good, smooth deformations out of your characters. And of course, you can always adjust how strong any of those effects are on a bone-by-bone basis. One thing that's very important to take note of when it comes to using the joint compensation options is what happens when you have an interrupting bone. Notice here that this bone I've got sticking straight up, and it doesn't matter the fact that it's oriented like this, it's just for illustration purposes, is interrupting the hierarchy between this bone and this one. Consequently, when you bend this bone here, whilst you can get joint compensation for it, joint comp for parent no longer works because this is its parent. Often when you've got an interrupt bone like this, it's for something like an IK plane or similar. It's not a bone that affects the mesh. So whilst in this little example the joint comp for parent is having a teeny tiny little effect, it's only because I currently have this interrupting bone skinned. But seeing as it sits right in the border there and takes up essentially zero space in terms of the geometry, the effect that it has is next to nil. Muscle flexing will of course work for this bone. Parental muscle flexing will not. As I say, there are lots of things that you'll set up in a rig like IK planes or offsets for this, that or the other that will interrupt a bone hierarchy midway through. That seriously diminishes your ability to use these joint compensation tools. You have got limited range here, which is always available for bones, but that's usually less helpful than you might imagine. It's also interesting to go back and have a look at how the strength values react in a setup like this. Notice that the joint is sort of rolling around there as I take the strength down for this bone, and I get this opposite roll for, of course, the lower bone there. You'll notice the fall off in the strength. It's not falling off very quickly from the top here. That, of course, is again down to the influence range and the proximity between the bones and the deformers themselves. These vertices up here, which are skinned and grabbing what they see as the end of that deformer, are further away from this upper arm bone. These verts at the elbow are much closer, and so as the strength on this bone gets dialed down, they start to pick up influence of this upper arm bone. with greater effect than those that are placed further away. As such, you can work the skinning of joints like this in a few ways, quite simply and with quite good effect without an awful lot of work. This pitch deal can of course be very important, because if you'll remember what we've seen in targeting and same as item and so on, you can get this counter rotation on the pitch channel on account of the Euler flips that happen when you have a targeted poled setup for something. Lastly, we have of course this bone icon size, which just changes the size of the drawn icon, has no influence whatsoever on how the bone operates or deforms or anything else. But it can be handy to set our rig up visually to appear just as we want or need it to. So that really covers a lot of the common ground for all of Lightwave bones, along with the specialties of Z bones. What we'll see in the next video will be joints, what they have in common, how they differ, and so on.